Welcome to the Grant Writing Simplified podcast. This is the place to learn how to make a big impact in your community through grant writing and nonprofit consulting. The world needs you to step forward as a grant writer and use your skills to lead with confidence. I'm Teresa Huff, former special ed teacher turned grant writer and nonprofit strategist. In my 20 years of freelancing, I've helped nonprofits triple their funding and exponentially increase their reach. Now I'm stepping up to mentor freelancers and nonprofit leaders like you who are ready to take your skills to the next level. It's time to get intentional about your vision so you can create lasting change in your community. Learn the skills and strategies you need to become the grant writer the world needs. Let's do this. Hey friends, welcome. I want to talk to you today about a common struggle that we see in the nonprofit world. And because of that, I've actually got a special invitation for you as well. Something that I see often coming up and in conversation and with nonprofit leaders is discussing overhead, meaning all the expenses it takes to operate a nonprofit. What should be included in that? What shouldn't? Should overhead be funded by donations and grants or not? Some people seem to think overhead's a bad thing. Back in 2013, Dan Pallotta released a TED Talk. And he addressed this issue. He took it head on, and he called out what is now known as the overhead myth. And he talks through, it really does take overhead and operating expenses to run a nonprofit. And even the other day on LinkedIn, I saw Sean Hale, one of my colleagues, who said, should it be called overhead or should it be called infrastructure? And that's an interesting food for thought. Some good discussion there. And because of that, and actually because of a LinkedIn thread a few days earlier by another colleague, Kirsten Hill of Firespring, she posted an article saying it actually takes a lot more overhead to really run a nonprofit and thrive than what the common misconceptions are. And so I rounded up a few professionals and said, hey, let's have a roundtable conversation about this so that we can talk through this and talk through some challenges and what can we do better? What kind of strategies can we bring to the sector? And so this is kind of turning into a thing. We're calling it Nonprofit Mythbusters. And we're going to talk through some of the common myths that are actually damaging to the nonprofit sector and talk through ways we can shift the status quo to be encouraging and helpful for nonprofits, and how can we as a society better position the messaging around nonprofits, what it takes to run a nonprofit, and that overhead is not a bad thing because it's what they need to fulfill their missions. So we are having this conversation on Wednesday, December 7th, 2022. You can sign up at nonprofitmythbusters.com. Before that, though, I want to give you a little sneak peek because this is actually a double sneak peek. One of the guests on the panel is Michael Thatcher. He is the CEO of Charity Navigator. And I happen to be interviewing Michael for the podcast anyway, so you'll get to hear him also in a couple weeks. But at the end of the conversation, we got to chatting about overhead. And I said, hey, do you mind if I record this? Because sometimes that's when the best insights happen. And he said, yeah, sure, go ahead. So I recorded that snippet, and I'd like you to hear that piece of the conversation today to set the stage for the roundtable that we're having on Wednesday. So I want you to listen to this and then also go catch Dan Pallotta's TED Talk before the roundtable, and then make sure you sign up to come.
So one of the things I think that's important with the new platform is, and what we're trying to do with the ratings, is to rearticulate the nonprofit narrative so that there's not this tremendous focus on overhead and how much gets spent on programs, but actually shift donor perceptions away from that towards what's the impact and what are the results that the organization's making? What are the other attributes that actually make me want to invest in this organization? ultimately, when we're looking at overhead, we're looking at where money's being spent. We're not looking at what money's actually achieving. The only way we can tell that story is, this kind of brings it back to the individual nonprofits. Give us that data. Give us your performance data so we can actually tell a better story, because overhead's easy. We pull that from the IRS tax forms, and that is what donors are using as a proxy for impact. It doesn't tell you a thing about impact, and it's actually can be really harmful if you underspend on actually taking care of your people. You will actually damage your organization. You'll have staff, you'll have attrition rates that you can't manage, because at a certain point, people have families. They've got to support their families. And if you're underpaying your staff, then they're not going to stay with you, because they actually have to make a living. So we should be paying appropriate wages for nonprofit staff. We should be telling the story of the impact we're making in the world. And Charity Navigator is really trying to make that front and center. If you look back historically, we were we've been part of different letters that have been sent to the donors, to the nonprofits on the overhead myth. But this is such an important moment right now, where we have so many issues in our world that need to be addressed. And we've got to talk about the difference we're making in the world. So if that's one thing, it's like, tell the story of the impact you're making. Use platforms like Charity Navigator to actually amplify that message, and stop talking about overhead.
I just want to hug you right now. I am cheering and clapping on the inside, because I see that so much, and it's such a struggle and a frustration, especially for small nonprofits. And I hear it. I see the churn that you're talking about, the burnout, the overhead, and the turnover in people. It's like a puzzle shifting around. Somebody moves and the dominoes fall, and it's like, okay, they're going to shift around in the community somewhere else. And it happens so much. And that inconsistency hurts the organization too, because then their programs, people build up rapport, and then somebody's gone the next week. Yep. It's tough all around. And nonprofit leaders are wearing so many hats, and they're often exhausted and don't know where to focus. I think these conversations and these supports need to shift. And what you're saying, we need to shift the way we are approaching it and the perception around overhead. So I'm, spot on, right there with you.
The one thing I'll say, and you've said nonprofit leaders wear many hats. We do. And the smaller the nonprofit, the more hats you have to wear.
Yeah.
That means you are not overhead, right? You are probably doing a lot of program work. And so one of the errors that I see a lot, particularly from smaller nonprofits, is that they'll put the executive in as a management or an administrative expense entirely. That's rarely the case. You know how much program work you're doing, you know how much administrative work you're doing, and how much fundraising you're doing. Do those allocations appropriately. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And so be careful how you actually report. You do have to report on this, right? In other words, that's the IRS rules are the IRS rules,
sure.
Also state rules are state rules. You've got to follow those. But know how you're spent, track your time, and then figure it out, and then put that in your annual reporting.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you for saying that and for clarifying that, because I've tried explaining that, and sometimes people get it and sometimes they don't. And it can be a tricky struggle to try and convey. And I think the more we educate the public and our potential donors and supporters, sometimes they just don't know. And we need to take responsibility for educating them and doing a better job of helping them understand what it really takes to run the nonprofit, and that paying people to do their job is not a bad thing. It's an investment in the program and in the community and in the impact.
100%.
All right, that's a bit of a sneak peek of what we're going to be talking about in a deep dive on Wednesday. And the overhead myth is one of those situations where in the nonprofit space, the status quo is not helpful, and we need to have these conversations about it to better help nonprofits and ultimately better serve our communities and better support their missions. We can come alongside them to do this, but it's going to take all of us continuing to shift and to have these conversations, to educate people. That's really where it starts. We need to back up. We need to educate in better strategies, better conversations. So join us as we talk through this. I'll be talking with Sean Hale of Philanthroforce, and he's an accounting expert. Sherry Quam-Taylor, who is a revenue generating guru. Kirsten Hill of Firespring. She understands nonprofit marketing and strategy. And then, of course, as I mentioned, Michael Thatcher, the CEO of Charity Navigator. I think it's going to be a fantastic conversation. We would love to have you join us you can sign up at nonprofitmythbusters.com. And make sure you bring a friend, because we want to help spread the word and keep these conversations going. After all, it's up to us to go out and change our world, one nonprofit at a time. Let's do this.